podcast is brought to you by Schema Business School.
Hello everybody, welcome back to the seminar on globalization. What we are going to tackle today is governance, market regulation and global crisis. One of the major challenges of globalization is that the politics of globalization lags well behind the economics. In a nutshell, the global political system is still based on the nation-state, sort of a Westphalia system, whereas cross-border economic trade and financial flows get totally globalized. This decoupling between global market forces and state regulation is most concerning regarding governance. What is governance? Well, 25 years ago, Aristotle wrote extensively regarding virtue and ethics, which are crucial to promote the ultimate good for human beings. Like Plato, he condemns the accumulation of wealth for itself, as well as usury and speculation. In a nutshell, he condemns crematistic. Virtue, ethics, and governance are also discussed, debated, and analyzed during the Middle Age and the Renaissance. If you travel to Siena in the midst of Tuscany in Italy, you will see the 14th century picture that invites governments and policymakers to strike a delicate balance between justice, wisdom, and strength. This is still up to date today, indeed. Governance has been defined within policymaking circles, including the IMF and the World Bank. But let's use Summers' definition of governance as sound public administration and service quality. The inverse of good governance is, of course, corruption, which is considered as a key criteria to assess the quality of good administration along with transparency and the rule of law. The World Bank defines corruption as the abuse of public power for private benefit. The so-called corruption equation is monopoly, opacity, discretion, and little or zero accountability. So fighting corruption requires to fight monopolies, to fight opacity, and to promote transparency and accountability. It's a new focus on governance and fighting corruption that emerged during the global financial crisis since 2007-2008. And why? Because the crisis is rooted into two major causes. Number one, income inequality, starting in the 1980s, offset by commercial banks with cheap and large credit. And number two, bad governance, corruption, and poor regulation. The global crisis, in fact, shed light on the need to enhance governance and to promote sustainable development. Where does bad governance come from? Well, Huntington in the late 1960s tells us that bad governance and large corruption stems from a lag, a gap between fast socio-economic change and weak institutional change. Examples are many. Look at Tunisia, look at Cuba, look at Algeria and Zimbabwe. Now, why do corruption and governance matter in the first place? Well, there is in fact a number of factors, including pressing demands from official creditors, multilateral, the World Bank and the IMF, bilateral, OECD governance, putting pressure on developing countries to clean up the house and to improve governance, to improve transparency in order to transform economic growth into sustainable development and poverty eradication. But there is also a growing demand for long-term value from investment funds, private funds like CalPERS, like PIMCO, like North CGM, Global Equity Management, which in fact will invest only in those countries, in those markets where you have good governance and transparency. Until the mid-1990s, corruption was considered like a natural disaster, like soil erosion. It was a fatum. You cannot do anything regarding corruption. corruption was officially placed on the IFI's agenda, World Bank and IMF, in the late 1990s at the time of the Asian crisis. The crisis in Asia in 1998 was largely the outcome, the byproduct of bad governance and poor regulation. Poor regulation is considered, to lower efficiency, to undercut the state's ability to increase tax revenues and to fight poverty. And this has been at the root not only of the Asian crisis, 98, of Mexico's crisis, 94, of Argentina crisis, 2000, but also of the global financial crisis in the developed countries in 2007 until today. Official financing to developing countries does not promote development if the money is recycled back to Geneva or Luxembourg, i.e. if you have corrupt elites. This means that economic growth and development stem from not only a policy but also a political choice. One of the reports of the World Bank back in the early 2000s shows that in Africa, aid money to countries with poor governance allows governments to avoid reform. In fact, aid money, official development financing, helps countries to postpone structural and social reforms. How to measure corruption and how to rank countries depending on good or bad governance? Well, the World Bank, in fact, defines governance as including 6 criteria, of which corruption. And on this chart, you can see how poorly controlled is corruption in Ivory Coast. Corruption is also measured by Transparency International, and we see that the BRICS countries, China, India, Brazil, and Russia, are still lagging well behind Scandinavian countries like Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. France is not very well rated. It's only 22 and not much improving. Finally, the Heritage Foundation in the US also ranks and rates countries depending on their so-called Business Freedom Index, in which corruption plays a major role. And again, France is not very well ranked, 62, as well as the BRICS countries. What is interesting to see is that, all in all, global governance has not improved over the last 20, 30 years. Corruption has basically not declined in the world as observed and measured by the Heritage Foundation. So the challenge today of global governance is in fact the decoupling between market forces, globalized, and national regulation. A key challenge is how to promote governance and regulation when the global political system is still based on the old nation-state system, tracing back to Westphalia in 1648 or the UN system of 1945. What we see here is that the combination of forces leading to the global financial crisis in 2005-2006 stems from not only income inequality offset by bank credits, but also loose regulation and bad governance. This loose regulation, in fact, has allowed a shadow banking system to emerge outside the reach, outside the control of national regulators and central banks. And this has been the trigger for a few banks to become too big to fail and to take into hostage national governments with expensive, costly bailout programs. We see clearly that in the 1970s and 80s, we have a decrease in the share of consumption within GNP in the US. This, of course, was a major challenge to boost GDP in the US. The only solution was to offset the decrease in disposable income and consumption by large commercial bank credits. And one of the key support of bank loans has been cuts in interest rates by the US federal system, by the central bank in the US, helping to promote large and cheap loans, offsetting the decline in consumption. We see here how large is a decline in the share of wages and salaries in the GDP in the US. It was around 52% in the 1970s. It was cut to only 44% on the eve of the global crisis. And the only way to offset this sharp decline in wages and salaries, to beef up consumption, was to provide households and consumers with cheap loans. This large increase in loans has inflated financial assets, and it has led to what I called hyper-finance, deregulated finance. And deregulation in the late 1980s has made possible the emergence of hyper-finance, almost fully independent from the underlying real economy. Free will finance, in which basically you have financial assets totally decoupled from the underlying real economy. It's striking to observe this chart. What we have, is the black line, which is GDP, the growth rate of GDP in the US. And in fact, banks' assets grow as much as GDP, which is, after all, logical. It's difficult to provide more loans than the real economy allows it. But what is striking is that in the late 1980s, exactly 1997, you have suddenly an abrupt increase in non-bank assets and non-bank financial intermediaries. Tremendous increase in these financial intermediaries. Not banks, but pension funds, investment funds, hedge funds, almost fully unregulated, to the point that banks' assets are larger than national GDP, not only in the UK and France, but in Canada, Japan, Italy, and Germany. So all in all, there has been a concentration of financial strength into a small number of large banks in the world, and in the case of the US, we can see that the 10 largest banks in the US account today for 60% of the US GDP. What makes the issue of regulation and governance more difficult, more challenging, is that a large share of financial transactions are beyond the reach of central banks. 20% of total deposits and claims get outside the reach of central banks in offshore centers, basically non-regulated centers. Tax havens, money laundering is also an issue in global regulation. It is widely considered that total assets in offshore tax centers are the equivalent of the US and Japan GDP, i.e. $25,000 billion as of today. So what to do today in order to meet the challenge of unregulated global financial actors, such as mega banks? Well, a good deal of the challenge, stems from deregulation. And Clinton, in 1998, eliminated the Chinese wall of the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 between banks and non-bank intermediaries. Clinton made possible again the merger of banks, investment funds, and insurance companies. So today, central banks in the US and the EU and Japan must meet the challenge of re-regulating the financial markets. As Senator Durgan in the US says, what we have done is to forget the lessons of the past And what was true in the 1930s is also true today, i.e. regulation must be tightened, must be enhanced in order to improve the power struggle between nation states, national regulators, and globalized market forces. The cost of banking deregulation is tremendous. As you can see on the screen, on the eve of the Great Depression in the 1930s, the number of bank failures reached 4,000. And it started again just after Clinton's deregulation in the 1990s. What is crucial today, in fact, is to control these large unregulated financial intermediaries. Samuel Johnson, former IMF economist, says today's global mega banks are too big to manage. It is time to break up the largest banks, make them small enough to manage and simple enough to fail. The objective is to stem the risk of contamination from the bankruptcy of a large bank, so-called too big to fail, which would trigger systemic risk and impose a hostage situation on governments with very large and expensive bailout programs. As we can see, the cost of these bank bailout programs has been very large on public and private debt. In most of the developed countries, public debt to GDP has reached more than 100%. So in fact, what was considered as bad economic management in developing countries in the 1980s and 90s is now what happens in developed countries of the OECD. What makes the matter still more challenging is that a good deal of the debt of governments is now held by investors, private investors all over the world. And these investors, in fact, impose close scrutiny by rating agencies on economic policymaking. So what to do? We know that the global crisis stems from a mix of governance crisis and regulation crisis. So the question is there a pilot in the plane, in the cockpit? Who is in charge? Well, we know that there is a number of international financial institutions, starting with the BIS, the IMF, the OECD, the WTO. But none of these institutions has enough power to impose global and even national regulation. The crisis, 2008, probably 2015, will be recognized as a crucial watershed between market forces versus nation states. What is sure is that globalization without governance leads to economic growth without sustainable development. The key issue is to promote regulation and to promote governance. It also means that development is not only a policy choice, it's a political choice. Globalization should not be blamed for every sin, including, for low human development. Most of the time, countries are responsible due to weak governance and high corruption. These countries on the right of the screen, are not only corrupt, but with low development indexes. These countries on the right of the screen combine not only very weak development, but also high corruption and low governance. They are not poor, in fact. These countries are rich with poor people. We can see that trade openness is correlated with low corruption. It means that as countries open up to the global economy, well, transparency gets better, corruption gets lower. It is exactly the same regarding corruption and development. Fighting corruption means also fighting poverty and transforming economic growth into long-term sustainable development. So it's possible to have, large GDP, booming GDP, fast-growing economy, and bad governance and corruption. What is not possible is to have bad governance and sustainable development. To combine economic growth and development, countries must implement good governance policies with socio-political inclusiveness. Take these countries which have the same GDP per capita of $15,000. Russia and Gabon, well, you live more or less 60 years there. Chile and Costa Rica, you live 80 years. In terms of the indicator of development, Chile and Costa Rica rank 40 and 62, Russia 55 and Gabon 106. Look now at poorer countries with a GDP per capita of around 5,000, one-third of Russia and Gabon. Armenia, Sri Lanka, people live around 75 years on average. Congo and Angola, people live 50 years there. And the Human Development Index is much better in Armenia and Sri Lanka than in Congo and Angola. Why? Well, oil resources and raw materials contribute to wealth concentration, weak governance, and large corruption. One of the few exceptions is Norway, where you have both gas and good governance and probably low corruption. So are we better off in Tunisia than in Algeria? In Tunisia, per capita income is $8,500, the same as in Algeria. HDI is more or less the same. Life expectancy also. But doing business index in Tunisia is much better than in Algeria, and corruption, although high under Ben Ali, is still much lower in Tunisia than in Algeria. And why? Algeria has the 10th largest reserves of natural gas in the world. It is the 6th largest gas exporter. Sonatrach, the oil company in Algeria, accounts for close to one-third of total GDP. In turn, Tunisia is fighting for growth and development with phosphates, beautiful beaches, Roman archaeology, agriculture, and olive oil, which means you don't have one single route of economic growth and development. The country is fighting, to promote economic growth with SMEs, private sector entrepreneurship, and competitiveness. All in all, economic growth and good governance are indispensable to transform GDP into development. Democracy is probably also a key input of development. Not as a copy and paste of the Western model initiated by the Greeks 25 years ago, 2500. Democracy is also a likely ingredient of development. Not, the copy and paste of the Western model initiated by the Greeks 2500 years ago, but some form of popular mobilization with free and contested elections and where rules can be challenged. All in all, development stems from the combination of growth plus those conditions that make it sustainable. And these conditions are housing, training, education, health, and some form of political, popular mobilization. Thank you.